Veterans Day is next Thursday, November 11th, and there's a tradition that started many years ago on Chicago radio, and that is Radio Hall of Famer Gary Meier talking about his father, World War II veteran Frank Meier, sharing his special recording about the 48-hour period of battle in December 1944 during his service in the U.S. Army under General George Patton. And Gary joins us this afternoon. Hey, Gary.
Dave, hello. Thank you for having me and my father's tape on once again.
You know what? This has been how long have you been doing this, really, on the air, on stations all over?
He recorded this in 82, 83, and we're talking almost 40 years now.
And you've been playing it ever since?
Yeah.
Wow.
There was a break there where I couldn't find the tape, and then lo and behold, the listener had been cataloging a lot of the old radio programs that I was on, and he had it, and I took it from there. And can I add something before we play it? I want to thank somebody, RENEE Tondelli. RENEE worked with me at WLS as an engineer there. She went to Hollywood a number of years ago, became a sound technician, and works on all kinds of movies. She's an Academy Award nominee. She took the tape a few months ago and cleaned it up as much as possible and added some sound effects, because it's on a little Panasonic tape recorder that he did this, and the quality had started to diminish, so she did what she could, so that's what you're going to hear tonight.
That's awesome. Well, first, we salute our veterans this week who protect our country and allow us the freedoms we live every day. And there was a generation that served our country that when the war was over, they never talked about it. Whatever was undiagnosed PTSD, which they didn't even know really what that was back then, physical injuries, the mental torture they dealt with internally, it was just never discussed, right?
Even through Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you talk about World War II, you can come all the way into the 70s with the Vietnam vets, and we didn't know PTSD. And sadly, a lot of these guys have committed suicide over the years. Finally, they came to realize, hey, we have to treat this trauma, and that's where we're at now.
Now, let me ask you this. So did your father, in all those years, ever sit down with you and share anything with you?
No. Yeah. In fact, this moment of this tape was I walked in to their house to say hello, and he's sitting at the kitchen table. This image is burned into my head forever. And he was sitting and staring at his little tape recorder, and he said, listen, I just recorded something. I want to play it for you. And he played it, and I was just blown away, because he had never said anything over the years. In fact, he was pretty beaten up in the war, lost the sight of one eye, and he had trauma of where he would hear a loud noise and think he was back in the war. When he had his heart attack and was being wheeled into the emergency room, he said to my mother, who was standing next to him, do you have the grenades? And he obviously didn't want to be reliving any of that as much as possible, but it came to the point where he had to get this on tape to get it out some way. And then he said, hey, what do you think? And I said, this is amazing. And then we played it on the show right after that, and the reaction every time we play it is unbelievably emotional from people. I hear from them through email and whatnot. As you would imagine, when you hear somebody reliving this moment of a war and this particular battle that he was in.
We're talking to Gary Meier, and we're going to play that recording right after this on 720 WGN. Stay Plier on 720 WGN. We're talking to Radio Hall of Famer Gary Meier about the true meaning of Veterans Day coming up next week. And now let's listen to the World War II story of Gary's father, Frank Meier, about the 48-hour period of battle in December 1944.
As I look out my bedroom window every December with the little farmhouse behind us, my thoughts are reflected to December of 1944. Our division had just received word that the Germans had broken through our lines and had advanced 50 miles into Belgium. The whole mood at the time in our camp was one of concern and apprehension, for we all thought that the war would soon be over, since we were now fighting on German soil. I knew that being an infantryman in General Patton's Third Army meant a lot of action. Headquarters had sent word down to all our companies to be ready to move out as soon as possible. The next morning, we piled into our trucks with our gear, well on our way to the front lines. It was a very slow-moving process, for the trucks were bumper to bumper, and the weather was turning cold with blowing snow. We trudged along all that day, moving at a snail's pace, going along at about 10 to 15 miles an hour. And in our haste, we even had to bring the German prisoners along with us because we didn't have time to dispose of them through the proper channels. One of the GIs I remembered even yelled out, "What are we doing? Bringing reinforcements for the Germans?" That day the column moved slowly due to the fact that we took all the secondary roads while the armored took to the main highways. That evening we stayed in a hayloft in the barn, and the temperature now had fallen into the teens. We covered up ourselves as best as we could with all the hay around us, and it was a very comfortable feeling after riding all day with the snow and the wind blowing at your face. It wasn't long, however, when the sergeant called my name to pull guard duty. Oh, I could have shot that sergeant for waking me up from that nice warm spot in the hayloft. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning. Time didn't matter much because you realized that you weren't punching a clock to go home. I pulled my first guard duty with a little Italian from Brooklyn. He was only about 5'2" and weighed about 110 pounds, dripping wet. We went to our positions together, which was a machine gun emplacement. He was a very quiet individual, although I did try to make conversation. I nicknamed him the Little Paisan, and to this day I still do not remember his name. During the course of our guard duty, he pulled out a little gas burner from underneath his coat and proceeded to cover himself over with his raincoat. And before long, he had a steady blue flame going. We had to be careful not to expose any of this light in the event that the Germans were in the surrounding area. He warmed up our rations while I kept watch for both of us. That was the first warm food we had had for 3 days. I said to myself, well, I'm going to keep close to that little guy for the cold days ahead. The next morning, our outfit started out on foot toward the front. We were told to keep moving until we engaged the enemy, for at this point we did not know where the Germans had advanced to. We had walked about 20 miles that day and took refuge that evening out in the open, digging our foxholes and keeping watch all that night. The next morning we started out once again. I was trying to stay close to my little Italian friend because the warm K rations now were very appealing to me. It wasn't long, however, that I heard rifle fire ahead, and our lieutenant yelled, "Hit the side of the road." I jumped immediately to a ditch covered with snow and laid there frightened with the realization that this would be my first major engagement with the enemy. We were now being shelled and pinned down by German tanks firing from the reverse side of the slope, which was from the little town of Hostert, Belgium. Our artillery started its barrage, but some of the shells were falling short into our own lines. This soon was corrected, and we inched our way closer so that our firepower from our company and the other flanking us would become very effective. Needless to say, the battle raged on all that day and late into the afternoon. The medics were hurrying about, picking up the wounded. By nightfall, the few remaining Germans had surrendered, and the tanks had rambled off to the next town, which was Eschdorf. I was amazed at how young some of the Germans were, 16, 17 years of age. They were all dressed in white fur-lined garments, which of course was hard to see when they were blended in with a snowy background. We still had our brown khakis and made a good target laying out there in the snow. Our outfit was quickly assembled, and we were told that night that we would make an attack at about 1 a.m. Our objective was the town of Eschdorf. After a warm meal and a few hours' rest, we again set out to meet the enemy. We had not gone very far when the Germans opened fire and pinned us down. Off in a distance, I heard some of our tanks coming up in position. Before they even stopped, the German Tiger tanks had opened fire and made direct hits on 2 of our tanks. I heard the men screaming, and then there was total silence. I laid there motionless on the frozen snow, looking up at the stars of heaven. It was a clear night, and all the stars twinkled. At this moment, I realized it was Christmas Eve. Christ was born today, 1944 years ago. Peace on earth, goodwill toward all men. This peace suddenly came all over me, and I wish to quote from the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. At this time, Lieutenant Gisco called back to his men, and he said, "Let's go." We proceeded to run in a staggered formation over the Nola Hill. Now, the small arms fire from the village of Eschdorf became very intense as our whole battalion of infantry moved forward. I continued to follow the lieutenant, getting up and falling down at his command. Now, the Germans started to open up with their mortar, artillery, and machine guns. We had finally reached the outskirts of Eschdorf behind a farmhouse, and as we were about to group with our platoon leader, we heard a tank approaching in the near distance. We all scattered in the farmyard and lay quietly as the tank went slowly by us toward the farmhouse and then toward Eschdorf. About 8 of us ran toward the house, and the rest of the men headed for the barn. Fortunately, there were no Germans here. We went into the cellar of the house and kept close watch at the entrance. It wasn't long when we heard tanks coming our way again, and thinking that our armored forces finally broke through the stiff resistance. But to our dismay, it was the German armor that was in command. We all realized that our battalion was halted in reaching its objectives, and a handful of men that were at the outskirts of this small village were trapped. I now began to pray to the Blessed Virgin to save us. As I prayed ceaselessly, I closed my eyes momentarily and saw the Blessed Virgin dressed in black, throwing a black veil over us. We were watching the German tanks moving about the farmyard, hoping and praying that we would not be discovered. Daylight was soon upon us on Christmas Day. All that morning, everything was quiet, with the tanks in the same position, waiting to spit out the death and destruction. Soon I began to hear our artillery. The shells were slamming all around us. Then our planes began to strafe the whole area. This continued on for hours. Then we heard voices upstairs, and they were yelling in German. We hurriedly fixed our bayonets and were ready for what was to come. I continued to pray the Hail Marys as we anxiously awaited. We all waited breathlessly as seconds seemed like hours. Soon the voices were gone, and I thanked the Blessed Virgin. The shelling continued on through the night. We all knew that our forces were getting ready for another attack on Eschdorf. That attack came in the early morning hours. We could not leave our cellar, for we were caught in a crossfire. The top part of the farmhouse had now collapsed from all the shelling. Our planes began to strafe again and again. And after a long silence, we looked out in the farmyard and saw our GIs walking toward us. We all were overjoyed. The Germans had retreated. I immediately started running toward Hosterd, and suddenly my eyes were gazing upon all my fallen comrades. My heart was saddened as I continued to walk slowly back to town. And then I spotted my little Italian friend, clutching his rifle in one hand and a small gas burner in the other hand. He was killed Christmas Eve. Christ was born Christmas Eve. As I prayed in a small church on a hill, my thoughts were with all my fallen brothers, for God had called them to their eternal reward. I wish to quote from John chapter 15, verse 13. And here is how to measure it. The greatest love is shown when a person lays down his life for his friends. As I left the little church, the command was given to move out. For once again, we were getting ready to meet our foe. I asked the Lord to calm my fears and grant me a happy death should it come. The season of Advent will soon be upon us. It is going to be December 1982. Christ will be born Christmas Eve. Men will die Christmas Eve. Nothing has changed. My fellow Christians, Christ is calling on us to bring his love to the world so we may rise above the animal to the human and then to the divine. This, my brothers and sisters, is my Christmas experience that our Lord wanted me to share with you. please pray for all my fallen comrades and the fallen enemy, for we all are children of God. And may we continue to pray for peace throughout the world.
You know, playing that tape, Gary, is such a tradition for me that has been listening to you for, man, the better part of those 40 years. But when you hear a story like that directly from one of the greatest generation, you almost get emotional listening to that, you know, knowing it's coming.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, well, that being my father, he's been dead now 30 years, and this is a moment that I can have with him. And the fact that you play this as often as you do, I'm sure he'd be more than honored to know that his message is getting out to all of these people that are listening right now.
But it's the impact. Like, you know what he's feeling through all of this, and him talking about his comrades that he lost. And I can't imagine knowing that those were the guys that he bunked with, ate with, fought with for so long, and they were no longer there. And something to live with that, you know, for so long after, 40 years after the war, rethinking that of all the friends that were with you that are gone. And that is part of fighting a war. And
he told the story, he told me this story after he and some old Army buddies got together in the late 70s. They went back to where they fought these battles. And get this, they went to this house and knocked on the door. It was the house where they hid from the Germans because they were overpowered. And these people let them into their house and hid them until the Germans went through. And they went back, like I said, in the 70s, knocked on. It was the same people that were still living there.
Oh, my God. Wow.
And they visited with them. And that kind of thing where you think, oh, my God, it's just amazing what these men and women went through. And you're right. They came back, started families, went back to work, and pretend like that didn't happen.
Yeah. And that's why we salute them this Veterans Day. Gary, always a pleasure having you hang out with us, and especially this afternoon. And by the way, if you want to find out more about what Gary's up to or catch his podcasts and his shows every day, Monday through Friday, visit GARRYMeier.com. Thank you as always, my friend.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.